Right, good evening everybody. We will be starting very soon. This is Clive Wilson. I'm the one with the funny logos around my screen and post-pandemic visions, if you're looking for me on your screen. And I'm delighted that this evening I've got Rod Beardshall, who is the Zero Carbon Harrogate lead on transport. I have, of course, got Jemima Parker, who is my co-host tonight. Jemima is the chair of Zero Carbon Harrogate. I'm delighted as well to have Greg Marsden, who is from the Institute of Transport Studies at Leeds University, or the University of Leeds, to give you your proper title, forgive me. And finally, Paul Haslam, who is a councillor with North Yorkshire County Council. So I'm just going to let everybody arrive. There's one or two still coming in before, I don't want them to miss any words of wisdom from Jemima. So just orient yourselves, understand what's going on. I hope you've all used Zoom before, but if you haven't, you will notice that at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat facility. So at any time, if you've got any questions or comments, please do put them into the chat box. And if you want to see everybody that's on line with us today, then choose gallery view in your options, usually at the top right hand corner of your screen, then you get to see everybody. And the people who are speaking will usually have a yellow box around them to denote that they're speaking. Although I see that my yellow box is centered around Greg for some reason, even though he's sitting there very quiet and patient. So still got one or two arriving. So I'm just letting them in. Anna and Jim, welcome. And they should be with us shortly. Fantastic. So just to while away the time until the stragglers join us, this is the second of our, well, in fact, it's the third of our post-pandemic visions. We had an original one early on in lockdown where we just said, what's going on and what do we want to see for the future in this part of the world going forward? And we just shared visions. And the event was very popular and people wanted to know more. So we decided to focus the forthcoming events around particular topics. So last week at this time, we were looking at property and what we could do with properties in and around Harrogate in order to mitigate climate change. If I seem distracted, it's because I'm admitting all these lovely people from the waiting room. So I think we're getting there. We're definitely getting there. So we had 40 people registered, as I explained to those of you that are online earlier. You can usually expect a 50% fallout rate. So, you know, we're expecting around about 20, and I think we've got round about 20. So that's absolutely fantastic. In fact, we've got more than that. We've got 23 online at the moment and still people joining. So, so let's begin. So our subject, as we know, is cleaner, greener transport. And I'd like to hand over to Jemima, just to, Jemima, introduce yourself and speak to the subject. What are your initial thoughts about cleaner, greener transport in Harrogate and beyond, I guess?
Thank you, Clive. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jemima Parker and I chair Zero Carbon Harrogate. Zero Carbon Harrogate's objective is to drive us as fast as possible towards becoming a carbon neutral district to play our part in the big climate change challenge. And transport is a really key part of that challenge. In many ways, nationally, we've done great work decarbonising energy to some extent, but transport has been largely overlooked. And when we look at our emissions in Harrogate, our transport emissions, using the government figures from BEIS, transport makes up nearly half, 48–49% of our emissions. So it's a really important issue for us. And some of those emissions we're a bit stung because we have the A1M running through the district, and that pulls in quite a lot of emissions. But also our A roads and our minor roads have a major impact. And so going forward, one of the kind of key things I think we need to tackle is all the local journeys that we do that don't need to be done in a high carbon intensive vehicle in cars. About 47% of the journeys in Harrogate and Knaresborough are 2.6 kilometres or less. So journeys that could easily convert to active travel. And that would make a real difference, not just to our carbon emissions, but also to our health and our well-being. It also possibly might make us a little bit more sociable rather than being stuck in all our private cars. So localism, keeping things local, would really help to cut our emissions. I'd love to see that. And it's interesting how the pandemic has driven us more towards that, made us all think about being a little bit more local. We need infrastructure to facilitate that. So we need safe, pleasant streetscapes that enable us to participate in active travel and entice us all to come out of our cars and be active. And we also need better public transport, because it can't always do things on foot or on a bike or an electric bike. So we definitely need better public transport, and we need to be creative about how that is funded. Clearly, there are some journeys for which using the car is very important, but we need to be thinking more in terms of shared transport, shared ownership models, car clubs and the like, to enable less car ownership, because half of the emissions of a vehicle are the embedded emissions in its manufacture. So we need to be thinking about less cars. And then there's the motorway. So I would love, just as a quick one-off on the motorway, I'd love to see a reduction in speeds, because we could cut 10% of the emissions from the motorway just by reducing speed limits by 10 miles per hour. It would be safer and it would reduce emissions. So there's a very quick flavour, and I know Rod is going to speak in much more detail for Zero Carbon Harrogate and give his views. But Clive, you did ask, so.
You're on mute, Clive.
Myself. If you had one action and only one action, what would it be? If there was one thing that you could change?
You're on mute.
Thank you, Rod. I will be cheeky and I will say something quite large, which will be an integrated transport infrastructure plan for the whole of Harrogate and Knaresborough.
So no small ask then.
No.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much, Jemima. And maybe we should go straight to Rod. So Rod, also representing Zero Carbon Harrogate and lead on transport. So you've already unmuted yourself, so please do introduce yourself and speak to the subject.
Okay, well, as I think you've already introduced me, if I chair the transport group. I've never came into the group with any specific expertise on the subject, just enthusiasm and wanted to get involved, learning as I go along. So, I mean, there's plenty of people. I'm hoping, without putting him on the spot, that Greg Marsden might bring. I've never met Greg. I've invited him to the meeting and I'm seeing him for the first time, I'm afraid to say, that hoping he might bring some of the expertise, and Paul Haslam some of the how do we actually get things done at a government level. But I'm more, I suppose I'd have to say, the enthusiastic amateur. So Jemima's covered a lot of the Harrogate specific stuff about how our emissions are a lot generated by the A1M, which we have limited influence over, and the length of journey. So what I plan to say is actually quite a lot more general. And then I was thinking that maybe when we come back to the group discussion, we can probably bring it back to specifics about Harrogate where people want to talk about that. So I sort of looked at it and thought, well, what do I say? And I thought, well, the webinars are entitled Post-Pandemic Visions. And I thought that's actually very apt, because pandemics open people's eyes to a lot of possibilities for how we can do things, and visions which might have seemed unlikely, if not impossible, seem now to be tantalizingly within reach. And I think the biggest message that we're all getting is that if something's important enough, we can change it, even if it does challenge a lot of deep-rooted beliefs in how the world operates. But before we can have a vision, we need to know what we're aiming for and why. And then once we have a vision, we have to think the hardest question of all: how on earth do we achieve it? So what we're aiming to achieve and why is probably the boring bit, and probably what you already know, but the consensus is we're all aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050 at the latest. And at the latest is important. And why? Because it gives us up to, and again that's important, up to a 2/3 chance of leaving a habitable planet for our grandchildren and our descendants. In other words, if we commit completely to the goal, we roll our metaphorical die, we'll most likely be okay as long as we throw a 1, a 2, a 3, maybe even a 4, we might still be okay. 5 and a 6, not so good. And I don't know about you, but those odds bother me a bit, especially when I think about my 6-year-old daughter and I think of her trusting view of the world and of her future. And I think that's why we shouldn't be afraid to promote a truly radical vision of a post-pandemic future. In terms of what needs to be done, I say, as far as transport's concerned, in very simple terms, we need to travel by less polluting modes of transport, and we need to have fewer journeys. A less polluting mode may mean we walk or cycle instead of using a powered vehicle. It might mean we go by bus or tram or train instead of a private car. We go in a train instead of a plane. It could mean using a vehicle powered by less polluting means, for example, electricity or hydrogen. Or where our destination is ours to choose, it might mean choosing a shorter journey, and something specifically holidays here, or possibly even no journey at all in some occasions. Being very aware of the scale of change needed and the urgency of change, we mustn't be complacent into thinking that technology will solve the problem in the timescale we need it to. Eventually, I'm sure it can, but in the timescale we need it, it could be too late by then. So a lot of emissions associated with vehicles, like Jemima said, are to do with the manufacture. So electric cars are not pollution free. They're certainly a step in the right direction, but we can't think they're the get out of jail free card. And although we're rapidly greening our electricity supply, we're a heck of a long way from where renewables can meet all our current needs, let alone those in an entirely electrified land transport network. Therefore, whether or not our own personal energy supply comes from renewables, and I hear people saying, it's okay, my electricity is green, it is very sensible to consider any energy saved as carbon emissions saved, wherever your energy comes from. But we do need fewer journeys. Even if local journeys can be largely transferred from private vehicle to active travel and public transport, we will struggle with public transport capacity for longer journeys where active travel isn't an option. I think I was reading something like, of all the distance, and I didn't write this one down, but I think of all the distance of journey covered in this country, something like 78% is by private car and about 16% is by public transport. So imagine trying to shoehorn all those long journeys into public transport. We can't do it. So we're going to need fewer journeys. And thinking many plane journeys are of such a length that travelling by alternate means isn't feasible. So perhaps we should be aiming, well, not perhaps, we should be aiming to avoid all but the most essential. And for freight, it means avoiding unnecessary consumption primarily, or buying local, although it isn't always true to say that local is the lower carbon option, but that's for that's a discussion for another day, I guess, really, but avoiding unnecessary consumption. So my vision, well, that's actually fairly short. It's one where our need to travel is reduced and the travel we do is more valued. We can build on the discovery that working from home is much more possible than we realised, and that business meetings rarely need to be face to face. Our planners and our transport authorities can create the space and the infrastructure to make walking and cycling pleasant experiences, and we can ensure that cheap and convenient public transport is much more available. We can develop car sharing to the point that anyone who needs to use a car can have easy access to one without ownership. And I hope that we can relearn that transcontinental and especially intercontinental travel is either a true adventure or a luxury, and that a holiday of a lifetime really is what it says on the can, isn't something we do every few years. So we get on to the big one, how to achieve the change, or to put it another way, why hasn't the change already happened? And I'm happy to offer my thoughts, but I'm actually probably hoping to learn as much as anyone else on here tonight. My own opinion is to achieve the change needed, it'll only happen if we get appropriate legislation at all levels of government. Concerned individuals modifying their behaviour won't come close to achieving the level of change we need. So I hear people saying, well, is it even worth trying to do the right thing? And I say, absolutely, absolutely it is. Because our actions cumulatively send a loud message to our decision makers to give them the courage to act and the knowledge that their electorate accept and even demand radical action. A belief that radical policy will lose votes is a big barrier to change in democratic society. Another, obviously, is well-financed lobby groups pursuing self-interest, and I'm not sure how to deal with this threat, except to try and ensure that the general public are as educated and as vociferous as possible. And the third barrier to change is lack of the imagination, lack of skill sets, lack of capacity issues within government bodies, such as civil service and transport officers. And I mean, no may maligning their skills, simply saying that sometimes their time is so pressing, it's maybe underfunded, and have the ability to look for, let alone accept creative solutions when you're all on to just do your day-to-day job, makes it very difficult. And it's not surprising given we're dealing with a complex system which evolved to solve yesterday's problems. It's not surprising, but it's a massive barrier nonetheless. And the best answer, I think, here is to try and promote the cross-fertilisation of ideas in the hope that decision makers can be influenced by good practice successfully employed elsewhere. And in terms of specifics, only a few, and then I'll be quiet and let somebody else come in. But in terms of specifics, what do we do? Well, critically, I think we should cut out the stupid stuff. We cut out things like airport expansion. Why would we even think about that? That needs to go straight away. And yet I saw in the local paper a couple of days ago that there's pressure and people actively lobbying to expand Leeds Bradford Airport, and some quite advanced plans in their heads. Stupid. We need to create an environment conducive to beneficial behaviours to make them cheaper, quicker and more pleasant than the damaging behaviours. And critically, I think we need to legislate or price out the harmful behaviours. So we do want the carrot, but we need the stick, because people's behaviours aren't just going to change quickly enough otherwise. Democratic changes such as closing off certain areas to cars, that will affect everybody equally, but I think we do need price-based mechanisms as well, such as road pricing, which we can do locally, or carbon taxes, which would need obviously international cooperation. And I think I've probably said enough, so I'll leave it there and move on to let someone else have a word, and then we can all come back and have a chat later. So I hope that was okay.
Well, thanks for that input. Thanks for that input, Rod. And the thing that I liked about what you said was that there was a real mix between some of the big things like flights and airports, and some really accessible things like, for example, us gathering here on Zoom today instead of travelling however many miles to meet somewhere in Harrogate and have this conversation. And you also mentioned active transport, which has been a big topic because, of course, people have been trying to do much more of that with the pandemic, and who knows whether that will stick or not. So I'll ask the same question that I asked of Jemima. Out of all the things that you said, if there was one thing that you could do, and you're not allowed to have Jemima's all-embracing grand plan, because that's what it's taken, if you could do one thing, what would it be?
I'd probably have to say make flying significantly more expensive, make it an absolute luxury.
Yeah, and in making it more expensive, would that be to offset the flight, or would it just be to make it more expensive?
I think just to make it done less.
Okay.
Oh,
All right, well, let's go to Greg. So Greg Marsden from the Institute of Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. Greg, introduce yourself, speak to the subject, and let's hear what you've got to say. You're already unmuted.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm a York resident, not a Harrogate resident, although
We'll forgive you.
Yeah, I've visited many times. I suppose we took on a commission for the Local Government Association back in November, which Paul will be aware of. And we were asked the question, so your council's declared a climate emergency, so what do they do next? You know, come February, we had a reasonably good idea of what we were going to say. As was pointed out by Rod, we have to reduce the amount we travel, something like 20% or more. We had to achieve a mode shift to bus of around 50%. We had to triple the amount of cycling that was to be done, and we had to electrify all of the vehicle fleet. We had to do all of those things, and you know, you can only electrify so quickly. So that's why the demand and the mode shift measures are so important. And just to underline the scale of the challenge, prior to the pandemic, for every one electric vehicle that was sold, 27 sports utility vehicles were being sold. So although we've got a green revolution going on, we've also got a load of nonsense going on in the background that's making it harder for us. So if you keep in mind that, you know, but basically those are the three things that you can do. You can reduce, you can change the mix of different modes, and you can electrify, but you can't really electrify that quickly because people have to buy it, it has to turn over. We don't have the technology for goods vehicles of different sizes at the moment. So then we've got the pandemic. So what does that change? What does it open up, and what does it close off? Well, I think the really, really important one locally has been the revelation of how little space we've given to people and bikes. I mean, it's not new to people who advocate this, but when you start talking about 2 meters and you realize that actually most of your pavements don't have here really haven't got anywhere to do that. You know, there's no space around bus stops. So the little amount of space that we've given to walking and cycling has been revealed. But the fact that in lower traffic environments, people will come out and do this. So at least for some of their journeys. So I think this is a really critical point. If we don't use this as the opportunity to reallocate road space, when are we going to do that? Never, because we'll never have a better time when there's fewer vehicles on the network. So it could be the start of something much bigger. It should be. If you include e-bikes into the equation, you can start to go above the journeys of 2 to 5 miles. One of the issues with walking and cycling is obviously it tends to focus on those shorter trips. They are a lot of trips, but they're not many of the miles. So it helps a lot getting people around, but it doesn't cut all the carbon that you need. So ideally, you'd have an extensive network and try and hook it into the growth in e-bikes so you can get longer distance trips being made. But I think what's really important about the reallocation of road space to walk and cycle is if you don't do it, then you're saying to people, nothing changes. So what are you going to, what are you saying to car drivers? Actually, you're saying we're going to accommodate car driving, and it's just going to be that it's electric whenever you can get around to getting an electric. So I think it's actually a really critical symbolic change. Now, there are arguments that we ought to be doing the same for public transport, and in some respects these have actually become more important, although fewer people are using public transport. We are going to have to pay for, or the government is currently basically funding bus companies, and will have to continue to do so for quite an extended period of time. The quicker the buses can move around the network, the fewer of them you need to service people, So actually bus priority still remains important, but it will be in tension a little bit with the walking and cycling improvements. That said, I think this is one of the things that's now much more difficult, which is sad to say, because I think you've got a great Harrogate bus companies doing some great things. But it's going to be a lot harder to win back the market when you're telling people not to use public transport. And that's going to be for some considerable period of time. People will get used to doing other things. So winning the market back is going to be harder. You've got more vulnerable groups which use buses. So until we've got a vaccine, I think public transport is going to be damaged. I think that's going to be years to recover. So actually just having a recovery plan that keeps the public transport network you've got would be amazing as an outcome. It's going to make investing in electrification more difficult. They haven't got any money. It's the government that's deciding now whether to electrify or not electrify buses. Could be a good thing, could be an opportunity, but the magic money tree is going to run out of leaves eventually. So can we afford to do that? A couple of other things which sort of spring out, which probably needed thinking about, but I think get pushed to the fore. Goods vehicles. So how much more home ordering is going on in Harrogate now than was 3 months ago, and it was already on a rising trend. It used to be that we would say, "Oh, these delivery trucks are a nuisance going around our neighbourhoods." Actually, they've been a lifeline, but they're really poorly organised. They're in competition with each other, multiple journeys going up and down streets. Actually, that's something where, done properly, you could take some control over consolidation points, whether they're e-cargo bikes or other ways of doing that. I think there is a way. Might need some new powers to do it, but I think you could manage the flow of goods into Harrogate a lot more effectively. And the other one, which was mentioned by both the previous speakers, is how much we travel in the future. And I think that's something that we have to try and jump on. And it's some of this is not transport policy. It's working with businesses on, how they manage their staff. It's working with government on taxation incentives and regimes that currently parking at your place of work doesn't incur any tax benefits that get weighed on you. But if you want to buy a bike or whatever, you've got to go through a different sort of leasing scheme. We just need to make it easier for people to not have to go to work as often as they have previously. It's not everyone at home all the time, but it's just going less. And I think we have to reimagine what shopping is going to look like, because retail centres were struggling before. I can't really see that being fixed very easily over the next couple of years. I think things won't go back to where they were. So what could we do with the space, or some of the space that might be freed up? Can we be creative about that? Because it tends to be in central areas that tend to be well served and accessible to other services. We put more people in there, maybe it will help to boost the economy of the town centre as well. So in a sense, everything's changed, but in another sense, nothing's changed, because we've got these options. We've got to reduce, we've got to do fewer of the trips by car, and we've got to electrify all of the cars that we do use. So for me, it's thinking about which of these opportunities are best fitted for Harrogate to jump on, and which ones not.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much, Greg. And one of the things I like about what you've said is that you seem to be really giving a boost to the visible. So when you talked about making cycle and walkways more prominent, allocating more space, those are very visible things that happen. So again, I'll ask you the same question that I asked to Rod and to Jemima. If there was one thing, and maybe if I just phrase it a little differently, if there was one thing that is already beginning to happen that gives you a lot of hope, what would it be?
I think I would probably point to something which I think could work in Harrogate, which is around goods consolidation. Not in the sense that used to be imagined that the local authority would have a shed on the outskirts of Harrogate and everything would go into there and it would all be coordinated by the local authority. But companies like DHL and your UPSs are able to drop a container somewhere and service it with e-cargo bikes. And I think if you could take traffic out off, you know, off the Harrogate streets of the sorts of goods vehicles you don't want driving around. They're often, you know, particularly a lot of them are owned by the people running, you know, for Amazon or whatever. They're not high quality vehicles. If you get rid of those and show to people what could be done with a slightly more interventionist approach, which allows them to fulfill what they want to do anyway,
Yeah.
I think that would be a really positive message for other actions that could be taken.
Well, thanks ever so much, Greg. So I'm going to move now to Councillor Paul Haslam. So feel free to unmute yourself, Paul. And you've heard from our first three panellists, lots of really good ideas and such a myriad of things that could be done, from the sort of the simple and the obvious, like providing more space for walking and bikes, to the magnificent, like making sure we don't overexpand on airports and we have good transport infrastructure. And of course, you're in the decision-making tent, for want of a better word, to get things done for Harrogate. What is grabbing your attention, and what do you actually see happening? And maybe even give us a sneak peek at the plans going forward. Anyway, introduce yourself and tell us what you think about cleaner, greener transport for Harrogate.
Thank you, Clive. I've prepared some notes that are fairly, which I'd like to go through in terms of the green transport agenda. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a county councillor for Bilton and Nid Gorge. I'm also a district councillor for Old Bilton. I represent the county council on the Transport for North Scrutiny Committee, and I'm actually the chair, so I scrutinise all the decisions, or my team scrutinise all the decisions that are made by Transport for the North, so which is quite interesting because that's about integrating. Jemima mentioned integration of transport. And so something. I'm also a member of what's called the Conservative Environment Network. This is somebody who beats Boris over the head and keeps telling him we need more environmental stuff. And then something that Greg's part of, I believe, will be Decarbonate, which is a group of northern universities that are working on initiatives and that sort of stuff. And I was part of the Nid Gorge Community Action. I started that with others, and we did get things changed. And so that's why I'm a great believer that we can get things changed. What I would like to do is just run you through a few ideas on green transport, because I think one of the things is transport isn't just about moving people, but freight and stuff, which Greg alluded to. So nationally, the percentage that transport contributes to our emissions is around the 30%. Locally, it's much higher, but there is a distinct resistance to change, and the resistance to change on this is, although cars are getting much more efficient, we're all buying 4x4s, perhaps particularly in Harrogate, but we're certainly all buying bigger cars. So if I sort of, we've got transport, we've got industry, consumption of energy, and domestic consumption of energy, and food. Those are the four sort of main areas. So the industry and domestic consumption of energy, that's doing quite well at the moment because of the renewables and all that sort of area. Food is an area that we still really haven't got to grips with, but transport is what we're talking about today. So for me, there are three main issues. There's the technology, there's the modal change, and then there's some perhaps bigger, more behavioural changes, all of which have been alluded to by everybody on the panel so far. So if we just talk briefly about technology, improvements in the combustion engine technology is not enough, and the government have given out a message that says by 2035-ish that all cars need to be zero emission. But we have some challenges with cars, for example, around their efficiency and their average occupancy. The average occupancy of a car is 1.6 people. It's not enough. We're not getting enough people into a car. And cars, and the average statistic is that cars spend 93% of their life parked. So again, we've got to get into some efficiency measures there. However, what are the options for cars? At the moment, there's electric, but we require an infrastructure of charging points, and people have range anxiety. Hydrogen cars could be on the way, but there's no infrastructure you can't get any hydrogen unless you live in the London area. And hydrogen cars are only getting about the 10th of the investment of EV. But I do have some good news on that score. Hydrogen, there are 2 large hydrogen sources being produced in the north of England, one over by the Humber and the other one over near Ellesmere Port. And this is good. This could be very good news for us in the north, because the problem with transport is that one solution doesn't fit all. So, for example, in urban Harrogate, cycling and walking may well be very good, but out in the Dales and in Marsden, we need some alternatives. And if we start to get hydrogen coming on board, then it will produce vehicles in that shape as well. So I'm looking to the future here on technology. Trucks are unlikely to be electric, they're more likely to be hydrogen. And again, the good news is we're getting these hydrogen centres across the north of England. Trains are going to be electric, but also probably hydrogen. But getting across the Pennines, the electric often doesn't have enough oomph, and therefore that's needed. So, and then this week on aviation, we're actually going to see the largest all-electric aircraft being tested. So there is some interesting news. Let's put it that way. But and then of course there's autonomous vehicles, and I think that's a big opportunity. However, it has gone quiet in recent times, and I think this is why they're playing with the network. But that's a quick resume of the technologies that are going on.
Can I just ask you, Paul, sorry to interrupt you, but on the autonomous vehicles, I've heard a lot of speculation that once we do get autonomous vehicles, so vehicles that drive themselves, the speculation seems to be that we will cease to own vehicles to a large extent. We'll just get on our mobile phone, summon one up, it'll arrive outside our door, and when we finish using it, wherever we happen to be, we can let it go, somebody else uses it. So the numbers of vehicles on the roads could come down. I mean, I've heard estimates as high as 90% reduction. I mean, do you fall into that camp? Can you see it happening?
Well, it's not on my notes here, but I do know it is happening. And that's the basis of companies like Uber and Lyft. And their philosophy going forward. And even now, nobody really buys a car. They sort of have a lease agreement. So the lease agreement's taking you towards that. So in essence, nobody will effectively, in the end, own a car. Now, whether it's 2030 or 2035 or 2040, and I can picture a scene where there'll be not a single car on my street, and I'll come out, I'll use my phone as the dog whistle, and the car will come round, pick me up, take me to where I need to go, and then it'll go off. But you know, that could be a bit space agey, and it's probably 15 years out. But car ownership will disappear because they'll become so expensive for one person to own anyway. So yeah, that's coming, but it's not coming before 2030, I don't think. And we have to do stuff.
I interrupted your flow, so do continue.
It's all right. I'll go back. But the other thing you said, so it should 9 in 10 cars could disappear. Well, my statistic of a car spends 93% life of its life parked fits exactly with that. Yeah. And there's an experiment going on somewhere in Norway, just outside Oslo, doing this precise thing that you're talking about. So anyway, getting back to my flow. But even this technology change is not enough to solve the problem. So just nice new technology isn't going to solve it. Because even if you look at the current lockdown, where no planes were flying, no trains were going, and no cars were nobody was going anywhere in anything, the carbon emissions only reduced by 17%. So where are the other 83% coming from? What's going on? It did not make as big a dent as you might have expected, which is a bit scary if you think about what we've got to do in order to achieve carbon net zero by 2050. So let me move on to the next part of how I see transport decarbonising. The next bit is what I'm calling modal change, which is a posh way for saying you're getting people out of their cars, onto a bus, onto a train, or onto a bike, depending on where you are. The key thing with this is we've got to make them easily accessible and easy to use. And at the moment, they're not. And we need to really think about how we integrate this transport. Jemima's wish, it is going on. I've got to tell Jemima that there are people thinking about this, whether it's at Transport for the North level, at national level, it is going on. But just to bring it back to us, so one of the things that I think we need to be doing is, and Harrogate Borough Council are the responsible planning authority here, is we need to look at how we plan developments. At the moment, are they designed around people, or are they designed around a car? So, you know, and most cities are designed around cars, the car parks, the multi-stories, but we've got to make shared road space a key element of urban areas in the future. So as I say, this is an opportunity for where the councils will come in. And we've, as I say, we've got to move people from and freight from road to rail, but different solutions will will be appropriate for a different geography. But for example, in France, they've taken advantage of the current situation, and in actual fact, Air France will not do any more domestic flights. But the people have an alternative. They've got an excellent rail service, but there will be no domestic flights by Air France anymore. So that's that's an interesting legislative change that's gone on there. But at the moment, Harrogate Borough Council, and I think they made the news a bit last week, because North Yorkshire Council, on behalf of Harrogate Borough Council, it was a joint bid. Sorry, my notes have just disappeared for a second.
Going to ask you to about another 3 minutes, Paul, max.
Okay, so but Harrogate is the one exception in North Yorkshire, in that North Yorkshire has transport, controls transport for everyone. But Harrogate actually has its own transport department as well, which works alongside North Yorkshire. And last week it came to light that about a bid we'd put in the Leeds region. So we've gained £8 million in order to look at the public realm in the town centre. So we're looking at Station Square, we're looking at Park and Ride, and all these type of things. So we're looking at bus priority, we're looking at park and ride, we're looking at car occupancy, car sharing. So in Harrogate, I just want to clarify something. Again, this is about solutions. 60% of all car journeys in Harrogate, urban Harrogate, are less than 2.6. Knaresborough, interestingly enough, it's only about 30% of their journeys. We've got to look at buses, we've got to make them more available, and we've got to look at cross-town routes, not just these radial ones. And we've probably got to come up with some form of nationalisation of the bus service. And we've also got to keep fares low. Trains are going to be a big element, and there's a lot going on with north, but the infrastructure in the north is very, very old, and a lot of work is going on there. There's going to be about £80 billion spent just on the sort of the north between Liverpool and the Humber. So it's a big investment, and a lot of work's going on.
Is that going to be prejudiced at all by people not wanting to travel on trains for the next year or two because of the pandemic?
Well, it's an interesting problem, isn't it? At the moment, we are telling people to use cars. At the moment, I'm hearing two stories. One of the things is that on Monday, when the car showrooms open, they think they're going to have a bumper time because everybody's going to have to buy a car to go to work. I hope that's not the case. Yeah. And I hope we can sort these things out so that we can get public transport on the way. But an enormous amount of freight, if the freight were to go by rail, that would make an enormous difference. Yeah. So and another thing that's being worked on at the moment is an Oyster card for the north. So in other words, you can get on a train in Newcastle and you can tap in and you can tap out in Liverpool. So that's being looked at. Active travel, which is something I'm really passionate about in the area, we've got to be looking at walking, cycling, scootering and even electric bikes in order to reduce those distances.
Fantastic.
I'm now going to move over because people come back and ask me questions particularly about that. But
I hope so. I hope we have time for it, Paul.
well, I'm just going to do this last bit very, very quickly. I think we need to look at bigger societal behavioural change. So here's a few for you. So we had speed limits, yeah, car sharing, working at home. At the moment, 41% of the population are working at home. Why is that not like a permanent directive? We could do more manufacturing in the UK. There's an opportunity to automate and use green technology to operate it. And that would stop all the stuff that we're pulling in from abroad. Because at the moment, if I then go on, so more food could be grown in the UK. At the moment, we only produce 43% of our food. So food security is an issue. We could do more homeschooling, though I can hear a lot of people groaning on that one. We could do much more video conferencing, whether it's office to office or whether it's home to office, an office in New York to office in London. So there's loads of things that we could do there. We do have to make our social space much more hospitable. So we need to look at the increased urbanization of towns because that will make the shops viable, which at the moment they're not if people aren't traveling to them. We also, you know, there's lots of open space, more shared space. And then the other thing is we probably need to buy less stuff. We need to reuse, recycle, repurpose, and then only dispose of it. And I could go on more. The last thing I'm going to say is, no, okay, right, that's it. I could go on. I've got more.
Well, let's see what our audience has to ask. There's been all sorts of comments, so I will encourage at this moment, because it would be great to know what's important from the people that are online. And one or two people have already put some questions and comments into the chat box. If I can encourage, if anybody else has questions, please do put them on there and we'll try and get round as many as we possibly can. Thank you, Paul, because you painted a real picture about what's important and also critically what's important to the authorities. So thanks for that insight into what's going on in the decision-making realms of our local areas. So just going down some of the comments, John Campbell, totally agreeing. I think this was with Rod, now is the time to be brave before we get back to old habits. So I think there was a bit of a thrust of that from one or two people. And then from Ian Hallett saying, I am sure the e-cargo bike business would be good for some local companies and shops to do deliveries. And John Campbell also loving the idea of the e-cargo bikes. How do we do it, he asks. So maybe let's just open that up to our panelists. Who would like to speak on how do we get e-cargo bikes off the ground? Just unmute yourselves, panelists.
Can I just,
go for it, Rod?
I'm not going to try and answer that because I don't know, but why, I see that Mike Kay has actually put some good comments, so maybe if Mike would like to speak on that.
Let's say you've invited Mike in. Mike, do you want to unmute yourself and speak to that?
If that's okay.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, my personal view is I think we should really seize the initiative. And as John said before, we start drifting back into our old ways, but Harrogate is an ideal town to make into a zero transport location. We should make it into a destination to show other people how you can do it. We've got all the right attributes. We've got a really confined small city centre. It's not difficult to do, and I think it's something that we should really push for.
Fabulous. Thanks, Mike. So what else have we got? We've got Rod. Anyone know what's the current carbon footprint of hydrogen production? Any thoughts on that? Any takers? Paul, go on, just unmute yourself.
Sorry about that, I was a bit slow. Yeah, the thing with hydrogen production, yes, it does have a heavy carbon footprint. However, the reason for it being on Ellesmere Port and on the Humber, is that they would use excess energy from the whirly turbine things that are out in the so the wind production that's offshore, and that's how it's been geared. It's to ensure that the effectively what's waste product when the energy demand is low, but they were producing lots of energy. So it would use green energy to produce it. So it should, in theory, bring that carbon footprint of that down.
So hydrogen a good solution, but making sure you don't shoot yourself in the foot by using fossil fuels to create it. In a nutshell.
Can I just say one thing there? What they're looking at doing at the moment on H21 green is we're looking at actually taking, obviously we get methane gas out of the North Sea predominantly. They're looking at taking the carbon out of the methane and storing that in the gas grid under the North Sea with the old gas grid and doing carbon capture, and then the gas that will be remaining will be predominantly hydrogen. That'll be going into the gas grid. The other thing in terms of creating hydrogen, if you're creating it from fossil fuels, it is quite an intense process, but if you're creating it from renewables, it works out about £6 a kilogram. So we're looking at doing 2 projects at the moment where we're looking at basically putting in some generation with solar and wind, and then having a hydrogen electrolyzer on site to create the hydrogen that the buses then use. And currently the going rate for hydrogen per kilogram is about £12. That's because it's coming from fossil fuels. It's half the price from renewables.
Thanks
and it's completely clean.
So I've got another question, trying to get through as many of these as we possibly can. This one from Rod, and it's to Paul. Paul, is Transport for the North planning for more travel or less? What are the sort of the decision-making criteria on that?
So the first thing is it's working out what it believes the desire and amount of travel is required, and then then the intention is to build the infrastructure that will support that, and also support. At the moment, the projections were for growth, but now we've had the pandemic, that will obviously change things. But the other thing that's critical is the mode of transport. That's the piece that they're trying to really rectify. It's about having it's about how you get between the large cities and the large concentrations of people. And that's what it's really about. So it's about making that much easier. So for example, the plan is to have a 20-minute train journey between Leeds and Manchester, and only 7 minutes from Leeds to Bradford, and those type of things. But those lines don't exist at the moment, and that's what we've got to build. Yeah,
I've noticed that Greg has got his hand up. And Greg, before you speak, which I'd like you to do very much, could you also tell us a little bit about Wandsworth as well and the cargo bikes? So maybe talk to us on 2 things.
Yeah, thanks, Clive. I mean, I think the question on Transport for the North's priorities is one that needs really looking at again. So that at the time they did the Northern Powerhouse review, the idea was that the way in which economies were going to grow was through agglomeration and productivity gains from everyone being able to get across all of the cities to be able to work with each other. Well, we're in the middle of a massive experiment of demonstrating that actually we can do a lot of this without having to invest billions of pounds in cutting the journey time between cities. Now, that's not to say that we don't want to invest in improving the quality of the infrastructure. There's not much resilience in the north. The train services are, pitifully short number of carriages and so on, so that the actual comfortable carrying capacity is not great. But I think the basis on which the Northern Powerhouse Economic Review was undertaken and what we're living through now fundamentally need to, they need to ask the difficult questions. I'm sure Paul and colleagues will be going through that process in Transport for the North. But the idea that the investment package next year looks like the one that was imagined 4 or 5 years ago, I think that's difficult. I'm not sure it was carbon compatible anyway, but I'm almost certain now that it will take a different shape. At least I hope it does. On on the e-cargo bikes, I think there's different ways of doing it. So there's definitely the link that I shared from Tooting was more of a bottom-up initiative where you get collectives to work together to share delivery from their shops. The other ones like your DHLs or your Yodels, they're about working with the big distributors to come and do single larger drops or 2 or 3 a day at a particular site. So you'd have to decide where you wanted to locate that and demonstrate how you could service the kind of drop-offs they have in Harrogate. I think you could probably demonstrate that they could do it with less human resource than they currently have to, fighting their way through the traffic and down the the narrow streets and whatever, trying to do their deliveries. So I think you'd have to address it from both ends.
Thanks very much, Greg. I've got a question from Ian. Ian, why don't you unmute yourself and put it to Paul yourself, this about how to engage residents? Then you can express it in your own words to him.
Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my question was really one for Paul. I think we see a lot of this, I cycle around town a lot, but also experience a lot of anti-cycling feeling and such like from other road users. I just wondered how can we engage a lot of the car driving community with the idea that, it's okay to give up space to cyclists and pedestrians. The mode of operation within Harrogate seems to be, well, let's take space from pedestrians. Let's dig up some of the Otley Road pavement to build a cycle lane. But why not think about, well, how do we reduce the number of cars on the road and use up some of the road space for cyclists?
Paul?
Wow, that's a big question. Anyway, look, I'll do it as quickly as I can. I'll be concise, I think, and succinct. So first of all, Clive, you didn't ask me the question that you asked everyone else, which is, what would I wish for? Well, I would wish that people would be more prepared to change. Yeah. So the first thing is I think there is a resistance to change. I also think that we have to do things such that we make that change easier. At the moment, I bore for Britain on the 17,000 school students we have that are under 18 that are going, that only 4% are actually going to school on their bikes, and the rest are probably getting there either through bus or mainly by car. So, if you just took some of those, some of those onto bikes and away from the cars, you make an enormous difference. So we do have to engage. I think it's a little unfair. I've been working, and the council have been working very hard. We've just got this £8 million out of the funds in order for us to do build a lot more cycle routes in the area. Also to look at things, more pedestrianisation in the town. And although it's not in those figures at the moment, we're also looking at park and ride, and there are 3 or 4 areas where we would suggest that cars are parked outside of Harrogate, and then people come in on a bus. So that there's some quite advanced thinking there that we're trying to work through at the moment. So I would say that. So I'm going to just. There's a couple of other questions that came through. That are also similar to Ian's in terms of engaging people.
Can you say who they're from as well, Paul, just so that I can tick them off my list?
Alex Minot also asked the question, or Minot maybe, I'm not quite sure. Apologies for the pronunciation. And one of the things, so at the moment there are 3, so we've got 3 initiatives going on in relation to reallocation of space. The first one was the fact that the shops are going to open in about a week's time. So if you go down Knaresborough High Street or you go down Harrogate, you'll find there's areas coned off to make the pavements wider. Now that's only a pedestrian initiative at the moment. What they're now looking at is what other initiatives can we do in order to help bikes. And then because Harrogate had already said it wanted to do sustainable transport, measures. We are looking very much at other things as well. So the 1.3 million pounds that's been passed across the country, and rough rule of thumb, we get about 3% in North Yorkshire, and then we'll get a bit of that. But that's being looked at as well, and there's a number of initiatives being looked at that should happen very quickly, that we can do to take advantage of this change. And one of them would be on the road from Mother Shipton's Cave up to Boggs Lane, where there's that third lane, and how that might be used. So that's being looked at very hard, and how we sort that. So there are a number of initiatives, but we do really need to engage more with the public. And not only that, the public need to engage with us and say what they'd like to do.
Well, one person that would like to say something that he would like is Nick Horton. Your question about environmental impact, would you like to put that to the panel? It's probably going to be Paul, but who am I to prejudge it? Nick, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, my question was, I mean, we're subsidising air. As far as I know, there is very little work that I'm aware of going into the real cost of some of the mining involved in producing cars, whether they be electric or fuel, petrol. And I'm just wondering whether anybody's aware of any work, and this is obviously an international thing rather than the Harrogate thing, but whether anyone's aware of any work going on to really cost the environmental impact of what we buy, and therefore what we pay.
I'm wondering if that's something that Jemima, do you know of any good source for reference on environmental impact reports of topics like this or other environmental topics?
I think in terms of the carbon emissions, Mike Berners-Lee's work is great in pinning down the carbon emissions. But Nick's nodding, so he looks like he's read that already. But okay, Ian Hallett is holding up How Bad Are Bananas, which is the carbon footprint of everything, which is one of Mike Berners-Lee's books.
Are you familiar with that one, Nick?
I am. I've seen both of those books.
And there is No Planet B as the other one.
Yeah.
And I know that Malcolm Margolis, who I can also see on the call,
Hi, Malcolm.
Has dug out some articles on the wider environmental issues of the battery technology for electric vehicles, and Malcolm might be able to share those with us if he
Well, I suppose in asking Malcolm about that, and to yourself as well, Jemima, is there any truth in the rumour that Zero Carbon Harrogate will put together some kind of reference library, online or otherwise? What are your thoughts on that for these sorts of things?
We can certainly look into that, and we do have a lot of resources already on our website, so please do feel free to browse those. Thank you, Clive, for the opportunity for me to do a little plug there.
It's intended. Malcolm, did you want to say anything more on that? Just unmute yourself if you would.
All Jemima's referring to is that I've some time ago, actually now quite a few months ago, read some articles which just made me very sceptical about electric vehicles, rightly or wrongly. You know, that in I think, is it the somebody will put me right, Central Republic of Africa or Congo, where they mine a lot of the cobalt for the batteries in terrible conditions with very serious environmental effects. These are very rare. They are talked about sometimes, but very often you get discussions about the pros and cons of electric vehicles, and they regularly fail to mention these issues. That's really all I can add to it.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'm just paging down the questions because we probably won't have time for them all, but please do also just have a little look around. There's one from Jemima, actually, probably for Greg. For all the new build across Harrogate district, what would be the best way to build for low travel emissions? So, Greg, have you got thoughts on that?
Well, I guess my thoughts about the recent reforms to the planning system are they've all been detrimental to carbon reduction.
Yeah.
I don't know when the first case will be brought by Client Earth against a local plan for not being consistent with the Climate Change Act, but none of them are. So, you know, I think as we, you know, it takes a long time to get these local plans into place. I would like to see it argued up to central government that every authority should be reviewing the climate compatibility of their local plans and prioritising those sites which are most consistent with their carbon goals. I think there's a real danger we're going to put some stuff in places that we know now that we shouldn't be doing. They have to be accessible to local services. They have to be accessible to decent mainline public transport. And if they're not, we're only kidding ourselves that they're going to be sustainable in any way.
I can see Paul nodding furiously. Go on, Paul.
Yeah, this is already sort of is already out there as a question, and I believe that local plans will have to go through a revised scrutiny of some description within the next 2 or 3 years, because what Greg's saying is absolutely right. One of the things that
2 or 3 years?
You don't. Local plans take forever. They've been doing the local plan since I joined the count. This local plan that's just been adopted, that started in 2014 when I first joined council. So they do take a long time, and change takes time, unfortunately. But there's a number of...
Do we have time, Paul, for this? I mean, are we not talking about a climate emergency? Isn't that the language?
Well, you know, we could be, you know, sort of, I can only push things as far as I can, but lots of people are. But this is why, you know, other people have got to be willing to change, yeah. And they've got to be prepared to get involved. So one of the things that I've written to North Yorkshire County Council on, as far as planning's concerned, is when they review, they are a statutory partner to any planning permission that goes on in Harrogate, because they're transport, they control the transport. And I've recently said to them that, are you checking this for environmental transport issues? So in other words, active travel, proximity to the train station or to public transport. And I have actually asked that, and I've had the reassurance that they're going to do that, but I'm observing and monitoring it to see if that's really true. So I take Greg's point. He's absolutely spot on, but there are a number of us already raising that as an issue, not just in Harrogate Borough Council, but I think across the country.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm getting to that point of the meeting. I've got one eye on the clock and want to make sure we get everybody away before 7:30. That's my commitment. And I would like to give everybody an opportunity, should they wish to take it, to just say very succinctly, and you can either do it in the chat box if we don't get a chance to get round to you, but I'd like to go down and give everybody an opportunity to actually say, what is the one thing that inspires you most from the conversation? Is there something that you feel compelled to do as a result of listening to our panel tonight? And just say it, just in a nutshell, less than a sentence. So I'm just going to go down people in the order that they appear on my screen. And this will include the panelists as well, although I'm not making any special exception for them, except that I will give Jemima the last word, as I always do. But Nick, I'm going to ask you, what's your thought, if you'd like to share it with us? Nick Horton.
Sorry, I'm a blank on this one. Nothing springs to mind immediately.
That's fine. No problem. Paul Haslam.
Yeah, no, I'm just keen that people engage. I believe, although it was mentioned that the government has to legislate for things, I'm a great believer that people should move first. And I think that we need, you know, I'd rather have a mailbag full of people with suggestions of what, not just vague suggestions about, oh, let's do some road space allocation, but where they would actually like to see it and how they would use it. And then that helps me get messages up, and it would help all councillors get messages through. So I'm looking for people to come up with what they would do. So
that's fabulous. So those of you that are lacking inspiration, one thing is drop a note to Paul with something concrete. Alex Minute, what would you like to say?
I'll drop a note to Paul pointing out all the suggestions that have been put on the Harrogate and District Cycle Action website that have very specific measures that a group of people have put together that we want to see implemented in Harrogate now, not in 3 years' time.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much. Alex Smith? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yep, I'm unmuted. Yep, evening everybody.
Yep.
As an ordinary resident, I just find it very, Harrogate is blessed in many ways, but seems to have a particular resistance to change. My main observation is, how the hell do we get something on the rack now, taking this opportunity? If you want to stop something happening, it seems form a committee seems to be the best way to do it. I just wonder what, if we want to come away from this pandemic with one thing, what is it going to be?
What would it be for you, Alex?
I would like to see something done. If Otley Road is Harrogate's, if the Otley Road cycleway is Harrogate's Brexit, which is being described as, I would like to do something with cycling that really overcomes that seeming resistance we have, with all the advantages we've got with green swathes into town and the rural environment, of doing something, being some kind of market leader, if you like, in cycling, particularly with the advantages we've given ourselves with things like the UCI, etc., as, you know, some association at least with cycling.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much. I'm just picking people at random, so I hope I don't miss anybody. Charlie McCarthy.
Thank you very much. What I would like to say was, I think now, from the discussion, I will now save for an electric bike rather than an electric car for the future. I think electric bikes are going to be the future.
I love a man of action. Thanks ever so much for that, Charlie. We've made progress already. Thank you. Chris Dickin, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have done. Yes, thank you. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things. One of the things that Ian Hallett said about engaging the community, and especially engaging residents, and this is really directed at Paul Haslam, because, and the previous speaker has just mentioned the Otley Road cycle route. The Otley Road cycle route is absolutely useless for cyclists. It's useless for pedestrians.
Here, by the way.
Sorry?
Here, yeah. That's what designed by committee.
There was no consultation whatsoever with any of the local residents before the funding for that cycle route was approved or obtained. So we had no idea it was coming. The council also take no opinions of the local people, and they totally ignore pedestrians. We've also heard that most of the journeys in Harrogate are less than 2.6 kilometres. Surely the easiest way of doing that is to just walk out of your front door and walk to where you want to go.
And is that what you would feel inspired to do the most, Chris, while walking?
No, because I walk everywhere anyway. I live on Otley Road. I work to my dentist down in Starbeck. I walk to my opticians in Starbeck. I walk to my doctors on Leeds Road. I walk into town. The only time I use the car is when I go for a big monthly shop.
Thanks very much, Chris.
No, I haven't finished yet, I haven't finished yet, actually. Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that there's all this talk on cycling, of which there is a big lobby for, but where's the talk about pedestrians? Most people, especially all the people I talk to around Otley Road, walk places. Nothing is done for pedestrians at all in this town. And in fact, the Otley Road cycle route takes away from pedestrians. And in these current times, that is just stupid.
Thanks very much, Chris. Must move on to somebody else. I appreciate your input. So, David Siddons.
Oh, hello.
Hi, David.
I'm on the screen.
You are.
We're talking about Otley Road, the Otley Road corridor in Harrogate is to receive a quarter of the entire housing developments in Harrogate. That's 4,000 houses. Now, if we're to persuade 4,000 households to get on a bike and cycle down, I cannot imagine what that would look like. And the problem, of course, is one of the, as it stands, is a peak hour problem, is getting people to work. Now, most of the people in Harrogate, only about, say, 40% of 40% of people who live in Harrogate work in Harrogate. They have to travel to Leeds, to Bradford, to York, to all over the place. Try to imagine that they will jump on an e-bike to get there is a bit difficult.
So what do you feel inspired to do, David? The question is, what do you feel inspired to do, personally?
I like the idea, I think, that Greg mentioned, that the local plan should be revisited because developments are taking place in the wrong place. I would like to reposition developments in a location where journeys can more easily happen by sustainable modes. At the moment, the planning system isn't designed, it doesn't give us development which will generate the right sort of transport. It's a highly car dependent situation that we're getting ourselves into. I'd like to completely change that.
Thank you very much, David. That's brilliant. So, James Smith.
Hi.
What do you feel inspired to do, James?
Well, it's a bit disappointing to hear how sort of passive the council are, that they waiting to be encouraged to do things or to be led by the people, which sounds very democratic, but I kind of like to encourage them to show some leadership and just do something, go for it, and don't worry about what car drivers think, just do it.
Okay, thanks very much, James.
I'm just going to interrupt there because these last two things, Clive. One is land can only be built on if somebody puts it forward. So it's the people that own the land that put it forward. So first of all, you need to understand what the building process is. So I think people need to really go through that. I'm not going to go into it just now because...
No, you haven't got time.
Exactly.
I'm going to move to somebody else.
And then the second point is that the last person who just flashed up, I'm sorry, it's James, I think.
James it was, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I happen to agree with...
Briefly.
But the Otley Road cycle route was exactly what he said. Somebody trying to show leadership and get something done. So the council can't win.
But you can keep trying. That's the good thing. Thanks, Paul. So let's have a look. I tell you what, we are running out of time, so I'm not going to get round everybody for obvious reasons. But if you would like to have a say, and you haven't already had a say, please just unmute yourself and go for it. Malcolm, you've got your hand up. Go on, Malcolm. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Got it. Okay. I just want to say, I think the key thing is that absolutely crucial to this is political leadership. And to say that, Paul's saying, and it's fine that he wants lots of people to send in their ideas and so forth. We've been sending in our ideas for years. I'm on the Harrogate Cycle Action Group, which is all campaigners, local residents. I'm on the Harrogate District Cycle Forum, which is council-led. And both Harrogate Council and North Yorkshire attend it. And we've been giving them ideas for decades, I've been involved for 30 years and others for longer. And it's been a complete, almost, no, not quite complete, it's been 90% a waste of breath. So what we need and what we haven't got is political leaders, and that's the big blockage. There are key figures who seem to be hostile to cycling. I don't know why.
James is giving you the thumbs up, Malcolm. So you're not on your own. So anybody else want to have a word before we go? Mike Kay, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
I'd just like to say that the COVID virus has made us all have to reevaluate our lives and what we do. And as a society, we've changed dramatically within 2.5 months. And I think we should keep the momentum going. I think the thing that I've really enjoyed is the silence, and I want that silence to be maintained. So I think we need to keep this going, not wait 2 or 3 years to do anything, because that would just be stupid.
Thanks ever so much, Mike. And Rod, you've got your hand up, and so has Ian. Let's go to Rod first. You just got in there.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that my greatest wish would be for politicians to realise that the COVID crisis, and I say this with the greatest respect to anyone who's lost jobs or lost loved ones in the crisis, will look like absolute peanuts compared to the climate crisis in terms of numbers of people who will suffer and the extent to which they'll suffer. And I'd just like every politician to consider the climate crisis in every decision they make. Simple as that.
Well, I know Paul's with you on that one. And Ian, what would you like to say?
Yeah, so I guess coming out of a lot of the comments that we've received, particularly around the Otley Road, I listened to a very good podcast the other day where a lady called Pauline Johnson was talking about how they worked from the bottom up, really, in Levensholme in Manchester to help develop better streets for their neighbourhoods. And I guess, you know, take some of the pressure off Paul here. You know, it does have to come from the communities, but maybe we need to think about engaging the communities a bit more and coming up with ideas so that you have that buy-in as to what changes are made.
Fantastic.
That's setting up an e-cargo bike.
I think we've been around most of the people that wanted to speak. I'm conscious that Neil, Alex, Rebecca, Jim, you're just words on a screen as far as I can see. I can't see you. But if you would like to say anything, please do feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself and have a go.
I mind just saying a few words. I think there's been quite a bit said over leadership, and I know we've got Paul on, but I think both councils, both North Yorkshire and Harrogate, are not good at engagement with the residents. I know in some of the engagement I've had, there's not a massive interest, and it's very difficult and very painful especially with any new ideas. I think the leadership isn't there. There's obviously a massive conflict between North Yorkshire and Harrogate. That's been evident on some of the emails I've seen and correspondence. So I think until you fix some of that, a lot of this just is never going to happen.
Thanks very much, Neil, and I'm sure Paul is listening to that. And by the way, I'm very grateful that Paul is with us this evening to hear all this. So, you know, if that isn't engagement, I don't know what is. Now, I am conscious that Alex, you turned your video on. Did you want to say something?
No, I just didn't want to be a random set of words on your screen. Feel a bit more engaged with the whole thing.
Fantastic. And on my screen next to you, there's a lady that doesn't have a name, that I'm sure she does have a name. Were you wanted to say something?
Is that me? My name's up a couple of times, but there's just one of me. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about experimental traffic orders, whether the council had thought about that in terms of closing certain roads at certain times, perhaps school runs, doing things in an experiment, seeing how the community respond and consulting them while they've got those traffic orders in place, because it's an immediate action. You can do that quite quickly, and yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think.
So, Rebecca, these things are being looked at the moment. Obviously, schools haven't reopened yet, but they are being looked at in all seriousness as to what we can do. I mean, the cones arrived on the street before anybody knew what the cones were even there for. In Knaresborough, the shopkeepers were moving them so people could park outside their shops. So, you know, sort of the actions got in front of the words in some cases. But no, you're absolutely right. We're looking at traffic orders and what can be done. And I'm pushing as hard as I can to get some experiments done, because if you don't try something, you'll never know. And I'm a great believer in bringing the streets back to the people. I think it's very important.
Fantastic. Well, is there anybody who wanted to have a penultimate word? Because I am going to give Jemima the last word, but does anybody want to say anything very quickly before I pass to Jemima? No. So everybody that wanted to say something has been able to say something, which is fantastic. Really glad that that is the case. And I really would like to thank Greg and Rod and Jemima and Paul for their input, but also their response to many really challenging questions. And I think overall we've got a real picture of the potential, you know, the very visible potential, like bikes on the streets and cars out of the town centre, through to more sophisticated solutions to problems. And there is a vision there for us all to grab hold of and to begin to take action, even if it's just leaving the car at home and walking to work or to the town centre. So with that, I'd just like to thank all our panellists and thank everybody else that has turned up to take part in this meeting tonight. Do encourage you to look on the Zero Carbon Harrogate website for future events and the UNA Harrogate website. They're all there. And hopefully we'll see you. I know many of you are actually registered for the next event, which will be next Wednesday. But let's hand over to Jemima to close the meeting with some wise words of wisdom. No pressure, Jemima.
Thank you, Clive. And can I echo your thanks to Paul and Greg and Rod for their input this evening and for tackling some quite difficult questions there. And thank you, Clive, for steering us through as well. Just reflecting on all the different comments, some really exciting suggestions that I think in Harrogate we could get a hold of, and I can see quite a lot of people excited by the kind of e-bikes cargo idea, and maybe that's, I'm looking at Rod and thinking that's something that we could be maybe doing something about with Zero Carbon Harrogate and working collaboratively with the council on that. And I would love to see some collaborative action, but we need, firstly, I think, to be honest with our residents that we need a huge modal shift, and to be honest about the size and scale of the challenge to decarbonise transport locally, and then putting forward a proposal for some really major changes, and then taking on board what several people have said about consultation. I'd love to see residents coming to look at a proposed plan and saying, no, this won't work here, or this would work here, and garnering all that local knowledge and experience, which, as Chris said, should have happened on the Otley Cycleway, and that opportunity was lost. And then, as Rebecca pointed out, just trying things out, doing temporary changes. I mean, it's worked so well in many other towns and cities across the world with temporary changes. It's cheap and quick to do temporary changes. People get used to roadblocks that turn their street into a cul-de-sac, turn it into a home zone, and then, while they may initially have opposed it, they then actually don't want it to be removed. So being bold in putting in those temporary changes, and right now with the need for additional road space for pedestrians and cyclists, we have that opportunity to do some of those temporary changes. And I think, as several people have said, we need to be really bold about those opportunities that we've got now. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. And as Clive said, look forward to seeing you at other events, and love to have your input for Zero Carbon Harrogate if you have time and energy to give it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jemima. And right on the button, 7:30. Wishing you all a good evening. See you again at another event.